Good morning, class. Today I'm going to read you one of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors, Frindle by Andrew Clements. I really think that you guys will like this book because it is about fifth graders just like you guys. You'll probably find that you have some things in common, or maybe not, with the characters that we read about in the book because you're both in the same grade. So based upon looking at the cover of this book, can anybody make any guesses about what this book may be about? It may be about a pen or children in school. Alright, so I'll be reading this chapter book to you guys over the next few weeks, every day in class a little bit, until we finish it. So in this chapter book, we will also see some illustrations that may help us understand the story better. So here's our first illustration. It's a picture of the character Nick at 2 months old. Can you guys tell me what you see in this illustration? That's right, we see a baby and we see that he's reaching for some pens. Based on that being the first thing we see when we open the book, can you guys guess about what this book may be about? That's right, it could possibly be about pens. I'm going to read the first two chapters to you guys today, and then we will continue on when we have free time in class. So our first chapter here is titled Nick. If you asked the kids and teachers at Lincoln Elementary School to make 3 lists, all the really bad kids, all the really smart kids, and all the really good kids, Nick Allen would not be on any of them. Nick deserved a list all on his own, and everyone knew it. Was Nick a troublemaker? Hard to say. One thing's for sure, Nick Allen had plenty of ideas, and he knew what to do with them. One time, in 3rd grade, Nick decided to turn Mrs. Deaver's room into a tropical island. What kid in New Hampshire isn't ready for a little summer in February? So first he got everyone to make small palm trees out of green and brown construction paper and tape them onto the corners of each desk. Miss Deaver had only been a teacher for about 6 months, and she was delighted. That's so cute! The next day, all the girls wore paper flowers in their hair, and all the boys wore sunglasses and beach hats. Miss Deaver clapped her hands and said, "It's so colorful!" The day after that, Nick turned the classroom thermostat up to about 90 degrees with the little screwdriver he had bought from home. All the kids changed into shorts and t-shirts with no shoes. And when Miss Deaver left the room for a minute, Nick spread about 10 cups of fine white sand all over the classroom floor. Miss Deaver was surprised again at just how creative her students could be. So just because Miss Deaver was happy with what Nick did and thought it was cool and cute, do we think that the rest of the people that work at the school will think it's cool and cute just like Miss Deaver? Do we think that the principal or the janitor may think it's as funny? Right, probably not. So let's keep reading to find out just how they reacted. The sand got tracked out into the hallway where Manny the custodian did not think it was creative at all, and he stomped right down to the office. The principal followed the trail of sand, and when she arrived, Miss Deaver was teaching the hula to some kids near the front of the room. And a tall, thin, shirtless boy with chestnut hair was spiking a Nerf volleyball over a net made from 6 t-shirts tied together. The 3rd grade trip to the South Sea ended suddenly. But that didn't stop Nick from trying to liven things up at Lincoln Elementary. It needed a good jolt once in a while, and Nick was just the guy to do it. About a year later, Nick made the great blackbird discovery. One night, he learned on a TV show that red-winged blackbirds give this high-pitched chirp when a hawk or some other danger comes near. Because of the way sound travels, the hunter birds can't tell where the high-pitched chirp is coming from. The next day during silent reading, Nick glanced at his teacher and he noticed that Mrs. Avery's nose was curled, kind of like the beak of a hawk. So Nick let out a high-pitched, squeaky blackbird peep. Mrs. Avery jerked her head up from her book and looked around. She couldn't tell who did it, so she just said shh to the whole class. A minute later, Nick did it again louder. Peep! This time, there was a little giggling from the class, but Mrs. Avery pretended not to hear the sound. And about 15 seconds later, she slowly stood up and walked to the back of the classroom. Why do we think Mrs. Avery got up? Do we think it's because she's angry? Do we think she knows it's Nick who's making that noise? Right, you're probably right. She probably is angry because that's not acceptable behavior in school. Without taking his eyes off his book and without moving at all, Nick put his heart and soul into the highest and most annoying chirp of all. Peep! Mrs. Avery pounced. Janet Fisk, you stop that this instant! Janet was sitting 4 rows away from Nick, promptly turned white, then bright crimson. But it wasn't me. Honest. There was a catch in Janet's voice as if she might cry. Mrs. Avery knew she had made a mistake, and she apologized to Janet. Someone is asking for big trouble, said Mrs. Avery, looking more like a hawk every second. Nick kept reading, and he didn't make a peep. At lunchtime, Nick talked to Janet. He felt bad that Mrs. Avery had pounced on her. Janet lived in Nick's neighborhood, and sometimes they played together. She was good at baseball, and she was better at soccer than most of the kids in the whole school, boys or girls. Nick said, Hey, Janet! I'm sorry you got yelled at during reading. It was my fault. I was the one who made that sound. You did? Said Janet. But how come Mrs. Avery thought it was me? As Nick told her about the blackbirds, and Janet thought it was pretty interesting. Then she tried making a peep or two, and Janet's chirps were even higher and squeakier than Nick's. She promised to keep everything a secret. For the rest of Nick's 4th grade year, at least once a week, Mrs. Avery heard a loud peep from somewhere in her classroom. Sometimes it was a high-pitched chirp, and sometimes it was a very high-pitched chirp. Mrs. Avery never figured out who was making that sound, and gradually she trained herself to ignore it. But she still looked like a hawk. To Nick, the whole thing was just one long and successful science experiment. And Janet Biscuit enjoyed it too. So what do you guys think? Is that appropriate behavior to do in the classroom, make noise while the teacher is talking? Right, probably not. That's not a respectful thing to do, and we like to practice being respectful in our classroom here. Although it might have been funny the first time, after we saw that the teacher had gotten annoyed, we probably should not have continued to do that. Alright, so we're going to move on to Chapter 2, titled Mrs. Granger. Can anybody guess who Mrs. Granger may be? That's right, she might be a teacher, or she might be somebody's parent. She probably is going to be one of our other main characters. So let's get reading. 5th grade was different. This was the year to get ready for middle school. 5th grade meant passing classes. It meant no morning recess. It meant real letter grades on your report cards. But most of all, it meant Mrs. Granger. There were about 150 kids in 5th grade, and there were 7 5th grade teachers, 2 math, 2 science, 2 social studies, but only 1 language arts teacher. In language arts, Mrs. Granger had a monopoly and a reputation. Mrs. Granger lived alone in a tiny little house in the older part of town. She drove an old pale blue car to school every morning, rain or shine, snow or sleet, hail or wind. She had a perfect attendance record that stretched back farther than anyone could remember. Her hair was almost white, swept away from her face and up into something like a nest on the back of her head. Unlike some of the younger women teachers, she never wore pants to school. She had 2 skirt and jacket outfits, her gray uniform and her blue uniform, which she always wore over a white shirt with a little cameo pin at the neck. And Mrs. Granger was one of those people who never sweats. It had to be over 90 degrees before she even took her jacket off. She was small as teachers go. There were even some 5th graders who were taller, but Mrs. Granger seemed like a giant. It was her eyes that did it. They were dark gray, and if she turned them on full power, they could make you feel like a speck of dust. Her eyes could twinkle and laugh too, and kids said she could crack really funny jokes, but it wasn't the jokes that made her famous. So based on the description of Mrs. Granger, how do you think the kids view her at Lincoln Elementary School? Do they think she's nice? Do they think she's mean? What do you guys think? Right, she probably is a mean teacher. Does anybody have any guesses as to why she may be mean? Good, so she may not joke in class, she may give a lot of homework. Should we keep reading to find out why the kids at Lincoln Elementary are scared of her? I think that's a good idea. Everyone was sure that Mrs. Granger had X-ray vision. Don't even think about chewing a piece of gum within 50 feet of her. If you did, Mrs. Granger would see you and catch you and make you stick the gum onto a bright yellow index card. And then she would safety pin the card to the front of your shirt, and you'd have to wear it for the rest of the school day. After that, you had to take it home and have your mom and dad sign the card and bring it back to Mrs. Granger the next day. And it didn't matter to Mrs. Granger if you weren't in 5th grade, because the way she saw it, sooner or later, you all would be. So here's an illustration of Mrs. Granger. And at the bottom it says Mrs. Granger loved the dictionary. So what are some things we see in the book? Right, we see some dictionaries. Can anyone tell me what's behind Mrs. Granger's head written on the blackboard? Correct. Use the dictionary. So is this how you guys pictured Mrs. Granger to look based upon the description we had from the narrator? Does anyone find it easier to connect to the character of Mrs. Granger, understand why she acts, because we have a face to match her with? I know that sometimes when I read, I find that easier. All the kids at Lincoln Elementary School knew that at the end of the line, 5th grade Mrs. Granger would be the one grading their spelling tests and their reading tests, and worst of all, their vocabulary tests. Week after week and month after month, every language arts teacher in the world enjoys making kids use the dictionary. Check your spelling, check the definition, check those syllable breaks. But Mrs. Granger didn't just enjoy the dictionary. She loved the dictionary. Almost worshipped it. Her weekly vocabulary list was 35 words long, sometimes longer. Do you guys think that's a lot of words? I agree, because we only have 15 words in our spelling test. Could you imagine having 35? And if that wasn't bad enough, there was a word for the day on the blackboard every morning. If you gave yourself a day off and didn't write one down and look it up and learn the definition, sooner or later Mrs. Granger would find out, and then just for you, there would be 2 words for the day for a whole week. Mrs. Granger kept a full set of 30 dictionaries on a shelf at the back of her room. But her pride and joy was one of those huge dictionaries with every word in the universe in it. The kind of book it takes 2 kids to carry. It sat on its own little table at the front of her classroom, sort of like the altar at the front of a church. Every graduate of Lincoln Elementary School for the past 35 years could remember sitting at the table listening to Mrs. Granger's battle cry, "Look it up! That's why we have the dictionary." Even before the school year started, when it was still the summer before 5th grade for Nick and his friends, Mrs. Granger was already busy. Every parent of every new 5th grader got a letter from her. Nick's moms read part of it out loud during dinner one night in August. Every home is expected to have a good dictionary in it so that each student can do his or her homework properly. Good spelling and good grammar and good word skills are essential for every student. Clear thinking requires a command of the English language, and 5th grade is the ideal time for every girl and boy to acquire an expanded vocabulary. And then there was a list of the dictionaries that Mrs. Granger thought would be acceptable for home study. So if one of your teachers sent that kind of letter home, how would you react? Right, you mostly would probably be very scared and disappointed, thinking that the next grade that you're going into is going to be very hard. How do you think your parents would react? Okay, so some may like it and some may not. Let's keep reading to see how Nick's mom reacted. Mrs. Allen, Nick's mother, said, "It's so nice to have a teacher who takes her work this seriously." Nick groaned and tried to enjoy the rest of his hamburger, but even for dessert, it didn't cheer him up. Nick had no particular use for the dictionary. He liked words a lot, and he was good at using them, but he figured that he got all the words he needed just by reading, and he read all the time. When Nick ran into the word he didn't know, he asked his brother or his dad, whoever was handy, what it meant. And if they knew, they'd tell him. But not Mrs. Granger. He heard all about her. And he had seen 5th graders in the library last year, noses stuck in their dictionaries, frantically trying to finish their vocabulary sheets before English class. It was still a week before school, and Nick already felt like the 5th grade was going to be a very long year. So we're going to finish there for today. Can anybody tell me about one of the main characters we met? Alright, so far we have met Nick and Mrs. Granger. And we learned that Nick isn't really a fan of school and that Mrs. Granger is looked at as the mean 5th grade teacher. Can you guys tell me your thoughts on the book so far? If you like it, you find it interesting, favorite part so far? I agree. I also like this book. So tomorrow when we have free time again, I'm going to continue reading this.